Can we trust the New Testament? Part 2. When enemies become witnesses. What if I told you that the strongest witnesses for the historical reliability of the New Testament were not Christians? What if I told you that Roman governors, Jewish rabbis, pagan satirists, and hostile critics, people who had every reason to discredit Jesus and the early church, actually confirm the core historical claims of the New Testament? Welcome back. I am Alan, and this is part 2 of our deep dive into one of the most important questions you will ever wrestle with. Can we actually trust the New Testament as a historical document? In part 1, we looked at the manuscript evidence, the staggering fact that we have nearly 25,000 copies of the New Testament, making it the best attested document in all of ancient history. We also looked at the internal evidence. The New Testament authors wrote as eyewitnesses and made their claims publicly, while hostile observers were still alive. Today, we step outside the New Testament entirely and ask, what does the rest of the ancient world say? And the answer is going to surprise you. John Warwick Montgomery lays out the defining question: is there other historical material that confirms or denies the internal testimony provided by the documents themselves? In other words, do independent sources from outside the New Testament corroborate what it claims? We are going to look at 3 categories of external evidence. First, early Christian writings outside the New Testament, church leaders who knew the apostles personally. Second, non-Christian ancient sources, Roman, Jewish, and pagan writers who had every reason to discredit Christianity. Third, archaeological discoveries, physical evidence in the ground that either confirms or denies the New Testament's historical claims. Let us begin. But first, a quick recap from part 1. We ran the New Testament through 2 standard historical tests. The bibliographic test. We have nearly 25,000 manuscript copies, more than any other ancient document. The earliest fragments date within decades of the originals. And the early church fathers quoted the New Testament so extensively, over 36,000 independent quotations, that it can be substantially reconstructed from their writings alone. The internal evidence test. The New Testament authors wrote as eyewitnesses. They made specific, testable, public claims in Jerusalem before hostile witnesses who were still alive and could have refuted them. No credible refutation was ever produced. Today, we step outside the New Testament entirely. Let us start with the early Christian writers. I want to be careful here. These are not the authors of the New Testament itself. These are bishops, church leaders, and disciples who came after the apostles, but who knew them personally, or who were trained by those who did. They wrote in the generation immediately following the eyewitnesses. And what they say is deeply significant, because they had direct access to living memory of what actually happened. Men like Papias, Irenaeus, and Polycarp were not working with hearsay or legend. They were working with personal testimony from people who had walked with Jesus. One of the most fascinating figures in early church history is Papias, Bishop of Hierapolis, writing around AD 130. He is quoted by the historian Eusebius in his ecclesiastical history. Papias records the words of the Apostle John himself, referring to John as the elder, about the origin of the Gospel of Mark. He writes, "Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately, though not in order, whatsoever he remembered of the things said or done by Christ. Mark made no mistake, for he was careful of one thing, not to omit any of the things he had heard, and not to state any of them falsely." Think about the chain here. Apostolic testimony from the Apostle John himself, preserved by Papias, saying that Mark's Gospel is a careful and accurate record of Peter's own eyewitness account. This is not legend. This is traceable testimony with named sources at every step. Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyon around AD 180, is another crucial link. He was a student of Polycarp, who was himself a direct student of the Apostle John. Irenaeus writes, "The 4 Gospels rest upon such a solid foundation that the very heretics themselves bear witness to them. And starting from these, each one of them endeavors to establish his own particular doctrine." Notice what he is saying. The heretics, the people who were trying to distort Christian teaching, could not simply ignore the 4 Gospels. Even they had to use them as their starting point. The historical foundation was too solid to bypass. If the Gospels were recent fabrications or easily discredited, the opponents of Christianity would have destroyed them. Instead, they had to argue from within them. That is a stunning concession from the opposition. Then there is Polycarp. He was a direct student of the Apostle John. He lived from AD 70 to 156. He died as a martyr at the age of 86. When the Roman authorities gave him one last chance to renounce Christ and save his life, he responded with words that have echoed across 20 centuries. He said, "86 years I have served him, and he has never done me wrong. How then can I blaspheme my King and my Savior? He was burned alive." And alongside him, Ignatius of Antioch, who knew the apostles personally, wrote letters from prison as he was being transported to Rome for execution, building his entire faith on the accuracy of Scripture. Here is the critical point. These men were not fools. They had direct access to the apostolic eyewitnesses. They had every reason to know if the story was invented, and they died rather than deny it. You do not die for what you know is a lie. Now we come to the section that I find most compelling of all. What happens when we go completely outside the Christian tradition and ask hostile witnesses, people who had every reason to discredit Jesus and the early church? What do they actually say? The answer is remarkable, and I want you to hear this clearly. Every major external fact they confirm was something they wished they could deny. Roman historians, Jewish religious authorities, pagan satirists, all confirming the historical core of the New Testament, not because they wanted to, but because the facts were undeniable. Flavius Josephus was a first-century Jewish historian who worked for the Roman government. He was no friend of Christianity. Yet in his Antiquities of the Jews, he references James as the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ, a reference almost universally accepted by scholars as authentic. And in a longer passage known as the Testimonium Flavianum, even in the more cautious form that critical scholars accept, he acknowledges a historical figure named Jesus, his crucifixion under Pontius Pilate, and the continuation of his followers after his death. From a hostile Jewish historian working for Rome, we get independent confirmation of these facts. Jesus existed as a real historical person. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and his movement continued after his death. These are the core historical claims of the New Testament, confirmed by its most natural enemy. Tacitus is widely regarded as one of the most careful and accurate historians of the ancient Roman world. He was certainly no friend of Christianity. He called it a destructive superstition. Yet in his annals, writing around AD 115, he describes Nero's use of Christians as scapegoats after the Great Fire of Rome. Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus. From Rome's most respected historian, writing with absolute contempt for Christianity, a person called Christus existed. He was executed. The execution happened under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Emperor Tiberius, and his followers became known as Christians. Every single one of these details matches the New Testament account precisely, and Tacitus despised Christianity. That makes his testimony more credible, not less. Around AD 112, the Roman governor Pliny the Younger wrote to Emperor Trajan asking for guidance on what to do about Christians in his region. He wanted to know exactly what these people were doing. His administrative report describes them as meeting on a certain fixed day before sunrise and reciting an antiphonal hymn to Christ as to a god, and binding themselves with an oath to abstain from theft, robbery, and adultery, to commit no breach of trust and never to falsify a bond. This is Roman bureaucratic correspondence, not theology, not apologetics. And what does it tell us? Christians met regularly for worship. They worshiped Jesus as God. They did this from the very beginning. This matches precisely what the book of Acts and Paul's letters describe about early Christian practice in the first century. A Roman governor accidentally corroborated Acts chapter 2. Perhaps the most powerful hostile source of all is the Babylonian Talmud, the central text of Jewish religious authority, compiled between AD 70 and 200. The rabbis who contributed to this text were actively trying to counter the claims of Christianity. Yet in the tractate Sanhedrin, we find this remarkable statement. On the eve of Passover, Yeshu was hanged. A herald went before him for 40 days. Yeshu is to be stoned because he practiced sorcery and led Israel astray. But no one was found who could say anything in his favor, and they hanged him on the eve of Passover. The Jewish religious authorities wrote this to discredit Jesus. But notice what they cannot avoid confirming. He was a real historical person. He died by execution. The execution happened at Passover, exactly as the four Gospels describe. They could not deny the event. They could only try to explain it away. That is the hallmark of genuine historical fact. One more hostile witness, Lucian of Samosata, a 2nd century Greek satirist who mocked Christians relentlessly. In his work The Death of Peregrinus, he describes the founder of Christianity as a man who was crucified on that account, and whose followers worshipped him and lived by his laws. From a pagan mocker who despised Christianity, we get independent confirmation. Jesus was a real person. He was crucified, his followers worshipped him, and his ethical teachings bound them as a community. Gary Habermas, one of the leading contemporary scholars on the historical Jesus, notes that from Lucian alone we can confirm multiple key historical facts that match the New Testament record. The enemies are testifying, and they cannot help themselves, because the events actually happened. Let us pause and take stock of what the hostile non-Christian sources have confirmed, independently, without Christian motivation. Jesus of Nazareth existed as a real historical person, confirmed by Josephus, Tacitus, the Babylonian Talmud, and Lucian. He was crucified, confirmed by Tacitus, the Talmud, Lucian, and the philosopher Mara bar Serapion. The crucifixion happened under Pontius Pilate, during the reign of Emperor Tiberius, confirmed by Tacitus and Josephus. It happened at Passover, confirmed by the Babylonian Talmud. His followers worshipped him as God from the very beginning, confirmed by Pliny the Younger, and his movement continued and spread after his death, confirmed by Pliny, Tacitus, and Lucian. Not one of these sources was a Christian. Most of them were hostile to Christianity. This is the gold standard of historical corroboration. Luke chapter 19, verse 40. Jesus said if they were silent, the stones themselves would cry out. They have. Welcome to the third category of external evidence, archaeology. Now, archaeology does not prove theology. It does not prove the resurrection. But what it can do, and what it has done repeatedly, is test whether the New Testament's historical claims about people, places, titles, and events correspond to reality. And the results have been remarkable. Let us hear first from the archaeologists themselves, including the skeptics. Nelson Gluck, the prominent Jewish archaeologist, not a Christian apologist, stated categorically, "It may be stated categorically that no archaeological discovery has ever controverted a biblical reference." He continued, "The historical memory of the Bible is incredibly accurate, almost specifically so, when reinforced by archaeological evidence." William F. Albright trained in the German tradition of radical biblical skepticism. He spent decades doing fieldwork in Palestine, fully expecting to find evidence against the biblical record. He completely reversed his early skepticism and concluded, "The excessive skepticism shown toward the Bible by important historical schools of the 18th and 19th centuries has been progressively discredited. Discovery after discovery has established the accuracy of innumerable details. These are not evangelical apologists making these statements. These are academic archaeologists following the evidence wherever it led, and it led them to the Bible." This story is one of my favorites in all of apologetics. Sir William Ramsay was one of the greatest archaeologists of the 19th century. He trained in the German historical school, was thoroughly skeptical of the New Testament, and was convinced that the Book of Acts was a 2nd century document with little historical value. He set out to prove this through field research in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. What happened next shocked him completely. He later wrote, "I began with a mind unfavorable to it, but I found myself brought into contact with the Book of Acts as an authority for the topography, antiquities, and society of Asia Minor. It was gradually borne in upon me that in various details the narrative showed marvelous truth. Scene by scene, detail by detail, Ramsay's excavations confirmed what Luke had written. The names of cities were correct. The precise titles of local officials were accurate. details that changed from region to region and decade to decade, which a second-century forger would have had no way to know. The political geography matched the first century, not the second. Ramsay was forced to conclude, Luke is a historian of the first rank. The skeptic who set out to bury Luke ended up defending him. That is what the evidence does when you follow it honestly. For centuries, critics pointed to Pontius Pilate as a potentially legendary or embellished figure, perhaps not a real historical person in the precise form the Gospels describe. Then in 1961, Italian archaeologist Antonio Frova excavated the ancient theater complex at Caesarea Maritima on the coast of Israel. He found a limestone inscription. The Latin text read, "The Tiberium, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea." This stone, now preserved in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, confirms three things. Pontius Pilate's name, his exact title, prefect, matching the precise language Luke uses in chapter 3, and his Roman province. The stones cried out. The detail the critics said was unreliable turned out to be precisely verifiably accurate. In John chapter 5, Jesus heals a man at the Pool of Bethesda, described as having 5 porticos, meaning 5 colonnaded porches surrounding it. For a long time, critical scholars called this a symbolic theological invention. 5 porticos was too symbolic, too convenient, they said. John must have made it up to suggest the 5 books of Moses. Then archaeologists excavating beneath a church in Jerusalem found exactly what John described. A large rectangular pool with 2 basins divided by a central partition, with 4 outer porticos surrounding the structure and 1 additional portico running across the middle. 5 porticos. Just as John wrote, the detail that critics called a theological symbol turned out to be precise historical description. John was not inventing symbols, he was recording geography. In 1968, archaeologists working north of Jerusalem discovered the burial ossuary of a man named Yohanan ben Hagolgol, dated to around AD 70. He had been crucified. An iron nail was still driven through his heel bone when they found him. Before this discovery, some scholars had argued that Roman crucifixion did not actually nail victims to the cross, that the New Testament's description of nail crucifixion was an inaccurate or legendary detail. This discovery provided the first direct physical evidence of crucifixion by nailing. The iron through the bone. It confirmed not only that nailing was practiced, but that the New Testament's description of it was accurate. As Geisler notes, this provides concrete and significant evidence that the New Testament description of crucifixion is accurate. The physical reality of the cross confirmed in the dust of the ground. F. Bruce, one of the most respected New Testament scholars of the 20th century, offers the methodological principle that makes all of this so significant. He writes, "A man whose accuracy can be demonstrated in matters where we are able to test him is likely to be accurate even where the means for testing him are not available. This is the standard we apply in every other historical discipline. When a historian gets details right wherever we can verify, we extend credibility where we cannot. Luke has been tested in city names, in political titles, in the names of rulers, in geographical detail, in the timing of events. And again he has been verified." Ramsay concluded, Luke is a historian of the first rank, and Miller Burrows of Yale, himself not an evangelical, concluded, archaeological work has unquestionably strengthened confidence in the reliability of the scriptural record. Let us bring it all together. In these 2 videos, we have run the New Testament through the same rigorous tests applied to any ancient historical document. Bibliographically, nearly 25,000 manuscripts, more than any other ancient work, with copies dating within decades of the originals. No ancient text comes close. Internally, written by eyewitnesses and close associates making specific, testable, public claims in front of hostile audiences who would have destroyed the narrative if it were false. Externally, confirmed by Josephus, Tacitus, Pliny, the Babylonian Talmud, Lucian, and by repeated archaeological discoveries including the Pilate Stone, the Pool of Bethesda, crucifixion evidence, and the precise geographical and political details that Luke gets exactly right. Bruce summarizes it with appropriate weight. There is no body of ancient literature in the world which enjoys such a wealth of good textual attestation as the New Testament. That is not a faith claim. That is a historical assessment. Now, All of this establishes the historical reliability of the New Testament. It tells us the document was faithfully transmitted, written by eyewitnesses, and confirmed by external evidence. But here is the question this naturally raises. If the historical record is reliable, then what do we do with what it actually says? Because the New Testament does not just claim that a man named Jesus lived and died in first-century Palestine. It claims he rose from the dead. It claims he is the Son of God. It claims his death and resurrection are the only basis for forgiveness and eternal life. Once you accept the historical reliability of the documents, which the evidence overwhelmingly supports, those claims demand a response. As Josh McDowell said in the title of his most famous book, this is evidence that demands a verdict. The question is not whether the evidence is sufficient. It is. The question is, what will you do with Jesus? If you have never seriously engaged with the historical claims of the New Testament, I hope these 2 videos have opened a door. Do not let your faith be built on tradition or feeling alone, and do not let your skepticism rest on assumptions that the evidence does not support. Look at the evidence, wrestle with it honestly, and follow it wherever it leads. Because I believe with everything in me, when you do, it leads to Him. If this video helped you, please share it with someone who is wrestling with these questions. Subscribe to Faith Glow Words so you do not miss what is coming next. We will keep walking through the evidence for the Christian faith, piece by piece. So your faith is not just something you feel, it is something you know.